Montana Territory, March 1884. The cold came down off the Bridger Range the way it always did in early spring, not all at once, but in waves, patient and deliberate, like something that had nowhere else to be. The kind of cold that settled into fence posts and wagon wheels and the spaces between a man's fingers when he'd been working since before the sun came up. The kind that didn't ask permission and didn't apologize for arriving. Cormac Wren had been standing in the south pasture since 5:30 in the morning. His breath made small clouds in the air that the wind took away almost before they formed. He was counting. 14. He counted again, moving his lips slightly the way his father had taught him and his father's father before that. A man counts his own cattle with his own eyes. No ledger substitutes for standing in the field and doing it yourself. 14. The contract with the Millhaven County Land Office said 42. It had said 42 for 3 years, running adjusted upward from 38 the year before that, and adjusted upward again the year before that. Because Cormac Wren had believed in the way that men who work very hard tend to believe that effort applied consistently in the right direction produces results proportional to that effort. He had been wrong about that. He was only now beginning to understand how completely he had been wrong. He turned and walked back toward the house. His boots left prints in the frost-stiffened grass. The barn sat to the east, solid enough his uncle Aldous Wren had built it to last. And it had lasted, which was more than could be said for most things on the property in recent years. The main house stood behind its stone foundation, good roof front porch that needed one board replaced on the third step. He'd been meaning to get to it. He hadn't gotten to it. There was a sound from the eastern road. Wagon wheels on frozen ground. Cormac stopped walking and stood still, his hand resting on the top rail of the fence he'd repaired twice this winter already, and watched the wagon come around the bend in the pines. He'd been told to expect someone from the land office. He hadn't been told much else. The wagon pulled up and stopped, and the woman who stepped down from it was not what Cormac Wren had expected. He would think about that later, about what exactly he had expected, and he would not be entirely proud of his answer. What he could say, standing in that frost-stiffened yard, watching her descend without waiting for the driver's assistance, was that she was not small and she was not uncertain, and she had a leather-bound ledger open across one arm before her feet had fully settled on the ground. She was perhaps 27 years old. She wore a dark coat that had seen practical use and boots that had been resoled at least once. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she had not spent time on it that morning because she had better things to do with her mornings. She walked toward him, reading something in the ledger, glanced up once to confirm his location, and kept walking. She stopped 6 feet from him. "You're Cormac Wren," she said. It was not a question. "I am. Nora Voss, agricultural consultant contracted by the Millhaven County Land Office." She looked at him steadily. "You're short 28 cattle from your last recorded count." Cormac opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing to say to that because it was true, and the only responses available to a man in that situation are denial or silence, and he had too much self-respect for denial. "Show me the south pasture," she said. "Now, if you're willing." He was willing. They walked without speaking. She matched his pace exactly, which surprised him. He was a long, strided man, and he hadn't shortened his steps for her. She kept the ledger open and made small notations as she walked, glancing up periodically to read the land the way some people read faces. By the time they reached the far edge of the south pasture, she had stopped twice to crouch down and examine the grass, and once to press her palm flat against the earth for a long moment with her eyes closed, as if the ground had something to tell her that required concentration to hear. She stood. She looked out across the pasture. "How long have you been running cattle on this section continuously?" she said. "Since I took the property, 9 years. No rotation. My uncle ran it the same way before me, his father before him." She made a note. "The root system is compromised throughout this section. You can see it if you know what you're looking for. The color variation in the grass, the way it lies flat in sections rather than standing. Soil compaction here," she pointed. "And here, the grass looks like grass Mr. Wren. but the nutritional value has been declining for years. Your cattle aren't starving because there's no grass. They're starving because the grass stopped feeding them and nobody told it to stop. Cormac looked at the pasture. He had looked at this pasture approximately 3,000 times in 9 years and had seen grass. He saw something different now. He wasn't sure if it was because she had changed what was there, or because she had changed how he was seeing it. 9 years of this, he said quietly. It happens gradually. That's the nature of it. A good man can do everything right and still watch a pasture die under him if nobody taught him what right actually looks like for that particular piece of ground. She paused. That's not a criticism of you. That's a description of the situation. Cormac was quiet for a moment. Then he said, So I've been farming this land wrong for 9 years. You've been farming it the way you were taught, which is a different thing. She looked at him directly. The question I'm interested in is who taught you and whether they had reason to teach you wrong. That was the sentence that changed something. He felt it change somewhere in the region of his sternum, a small but distinct shift in the way he was oriented toward the problem. He had come to this morning thinking about a pasture. He left it thinking about something else entirely. They walked the water situation next. The East Creek had been supplying the trough system since 1882. Cormac had switched to it from the North Spring after a ranch hand told him the spring was running dry. Unreliable going forward, the man had said best to move the piping to the creek while the weather was good. Cormac had done it. It had seemed like sound advice from a man who knew the land. Nora crouched at the main trough and looked at the water line. The mineral deposits ran in a gray-white band around the inner edge, not dramatic, not obviously wrong, just present in the way of things that have been accumulating for a long time without anyone looking closely enough to notice. She looked up at him. What year did you switch from the North Spring to the creek? 82. Did you have the creek water tested? He hadn't. She stood. There was a geological event upstream in the spring of 1881. A gypsum shelf collapse. It's in the County Geological Report, page 43. The sulfate levels in this creek have been elevated since then. Not enough to kill cattle outright. Enough to suppress appetite. Enough to compromise gut function over time. Enough to make a herd that looks like it's being fed adequately actually absorb a fraction of the nutrition it should. She looked at the trough. Your cattle aren't dying of one thing, Mr. Wren. They're dying of several small things compounding each other. Bad soil, bad water, and I suspect bad bloodlines, which we'll look at when I've reviewed the purchase records. Cormac stood very still. The North Spring, he said. The one I stopped using. What about it? The man who told me it was running dry. His name was Devlin. Broad through the shoulders, quiet manner came with a recommendation when I first took the property. He worked the ranch for about 2 years before I had to let the hands go. He paused, pulling the memory forward. I trusted him because he knew the land. Or seemed to. Is he still in the area? No. Moved on after I let him go. I never asked where. Nora went to her bag and produced a rolled paper which she unfolded and held out toward him. A map, the county land survey dated 1875. Your water rights documentation from the original title, she said. Filed 1875. The North Spring is listed as the primary water source for this property, permanent and transferable with the land. There's a maintenance clause. If a primary source is abandoned without documented cause for more than 5 consecutive years, the county can petition to revert the water rights. She let him look at the map. You switched in 1882, she said. It's 1884. You've been off the spring for 2 years. You have 3 years before that clause becomes relevant. Is it still running? Cormac said. The spring. According to the County Geological Survey, it's one of the most reliable freshwater sources in this section of the territory. Fed from the Upper Bridger watershed, it hasn't run dry in recorded history. She rolled the map back up. Someone told you it was going dry. Devlin. Who sent Devlin to you? Cormac looked at her. The question hung in the cold spring air between them like smoke from a fire he hadn't known was burning. The honest answer was that he'd never asked, because Devlin had shown up in the early months of his tenure with a recommendation from Douglas, Hahn Cormac's secondary lender, a man he'd known by reputation for years before he'd needed the loan. Hahn had presented Devlin as reliable and experienced. Cormac had hired him without further inquiry, the way you hire a man recommended by someone you trust, which is to say, without the scrutiny you'd apply to a stranger. He didn't say any of this out loud, but something shifted again deeper this time, and colder, in the way of a man who has just understood that two things he thought were unrelated are in fact the same thing. "Show me where the spring is," Nora said. He knew exactly where it was. He had walked past it for 9 years and not used it because a man named Devlin, who came recommended by his lender, had told him it was unreliable. They went north. The ground rose slightly through a stand of lodgepole pine, and the air changed that freshwater smell that has nothing to do with minerals or sediment, just the smell of water that has come a long way down through clean rock. The spring emerged from a seam in the hillside 20 yards into the trees, running clear and cold into a natural basin improved with cut stone by whoever had originally settled the land. Cormac stood and looked at it. It was running. It had clearly been running without interruption for a very long time. The stone basin was clean. The overflow channel was worn smooth. There was no sign of diminished flow. If anything, spring snowmelt had it running fuller than it would in July. He crouched and put his hand in the water. Cold, clean, no sulfate taste, no mineral sharpness, just water the way water is supposed to be. He stood. "We need to redirect the supply line," he said. Not a question, not a request for permission. A decision made in the moment he stood up from the water, with his hand still cold from it. "Yes," Nora said. "Today, if possible. I have pipe and fittings in the barn. I'll need to trench about 60 yards to reach the trough system." He was already calculating the grade. 4 hours with one man working. "I can manage the level." She had produced a small surveying level from her bag. Of course she had. "Then we start after we get the tools." The work was brutal in the way of early spring labor. The ground not fully thawed, the pickaxe ringing off half-frozen subsoil in the upper section, the trench walls wanting to collapse in the lower section where the ground was muddier. Cormac worked with the economy of motion that comes from 20 years of physical labor. He didn't waste effort. He didn't complain. He had been taught that complaining was something you did when you had already decided to stop, and he had not yet decided to stop. Nora walked the grade, calling adjustments in a voice that was neither loud nor uncertain. She had marked the route herself, accounting for the natural drainage pattern of the hillside in a way that would prevent frost heave from disrupting the pipe over the first winter. He hadn't asked her to account for frost heave. She had done it because she had thought far enough ahead that accounting for it was simply part of the calculation. Around midday, she said without looking up from the level, "How did your uncle come to have this land?" "Bought it in 1873, Cormac said. "Came out from Ohio with enough money saved from 20 years of blacksmithing to do it properly. He was 50 years old and he wanted something that would last past him." He swung the pickaxe and let the silence sit for a moment. "He left it to me when he died. Said I was the only one in the family who understood what it meant to build something with your hands." "And your background?" "Same trade. I worked iron in his forge from the time I was 14. Came out to help him run the land when his health started going. Stayed." He paused. "Didn't have anywhere else I wanted to be." She made a mark on her stake. "My father was Silas Voss, 22 years as a livestock assessor for the state of Kansas. I went with him on most of his work from the time I was 8 years old." She moved the level. He had a talent for seeing what was wrong with other people's land, and a persistent blindness about his own. He lost his property in the spring of 1876. He was gone by August of that year. "I'm sorry," Cormac said. "Don't be." She said it without harshness. "Be grateful that I watched it happen clearly enough to understand exactly what it looks like when a man who knows better chooses not to act." She adjusted the stake. "That's why I do this work. Not because the land office contracted me, because I cannot stand in front of a situation that has a solution and walk away from it. Cormac let that sit while he worked. After a while, he said, "And this situation has a solution." "Every situation I've seen has had one," she said. "Some are more complicated than others. Yours is not particularly complicated once you know where to look." She looked at him steadily. "Someone made sure you didn't know where to look." The afternoon light was getting long by the time they finished the trench and set the pipe. Cormac made the connections himself, working with the same hands that had made iron connections for years before he'd taken the land. The pipe sat true. The grade was right. He opened the valve at the spring end. They walked down and watched the water arrive at the main trough. It came clear, cold, moving fast through clean pipe that had never carried anything but the right water. 2 cattle at the north end of the south pasture found it within the hour. They drank for a long time, that deep and patient drinking that animals do when they find something they've been needing without knowing how to ask for it. Cormac watched them. He had been watching cattle on this land for 9 years. He knew the difference between an animal drinking because it was the available water and an animal drinking because it had found the right water. These cattle were doing the second thing. "They know," he said quietly. "They always know," Nora said. "They just can't tell you in a language you'll hear." That evening, Cormac went to the cattle market in Millhaven. He went alone while Nora reviewed the records she'd asked to see. He went because there were 2 men he usually saw at the Tuesday market. Emmett Hale and Tom Vesper, ranchers he'd known from auction days for the better part of a decade. Emmett Hale was 50 years old, broad from work rather than softness, with the stillness of a man who had learned that most things required less motion and more patience than other people thought. Tom Vesper was 35, with the look of someone who had been frightened long enough that it had become his resting state. Cormac found Hale near the yearling pens. They talked the way men talk at cattle markets, sideways through the subject rather than at it. Cormac asked how the herd was running. Hale said not as well as it ought. Cormac asked what he meant. Hale said he'd lost 11 head in 2 years and couldn't account for it, no matter how he turned the problem. "What are you running for water?" Cormac said. "Hale named a creek source on his eastern boundary, and you've been buying from Haskell County." Hale looked at him, then the careful look of a man trying to determine whether a question is innocent. "Few years now," he said. "Good recommendation on the bloodlines." "Who recommended them?" A pause. "Douglas Hahn, when I took the secondary paper." Cormac kept his face neutral. "Tom Vesper around." He found Vesper near the grain exchange. Vesper had a secondary lien with Hahn. He bought from Haskell County. He'd lost significant numbers over 3 years in ways he attributed to bad luck and poor seasons. Cormac rode home before full dark. He came in through the kitchen. Nora was at the table with his ledgers open before her 3 lanterns, going papers, spread with the precision of someone who has learned to make their own light in the dark hours. She looked up at him, read his face. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Hale and Vesper," he said. "They're running the same situation I'm running. Secondary debt with Hahn, Haskell County cattle, losses they can't explain." He put his hands flat on the table. "I'm not the only one." Nora was still for a moment. Then, "No, you're probably not." She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to a line near the bottom of the 1881 column. "I've been looking at your purchase records. Your Haskell County cattle die at nearly 3 times the rate of the 2 animals you bought at the Abilene stockyard in 1880. She paused, "And I found something else." The entry was there in his uncle's handwriting. Aldous Wren had kept the books before Cormac, and his script was distinctive, the letters slightly backward slanting in the way of a left-handed man who'd been taught to write right-handed. $340. August 1881. Paid to a surveying company in Dodge City, Kansas. There was no corresponding entry describing what the survey had covered. No report in any of the files. No map, no boundary confirmation, no geological summary. $340 gone into a company in another state, and nothing had ever come back. That's 4 times the standard rate for a boundary survey, Nora said quietly. Cormac stared at the entry. My uncle paid for that. Your uncle signed the disbursement, she said. Whether he understood what he was commissioning is a different question. When did he fall ill? Summer of 1881. He was gone by September. This payment was made in August. Cormac sat back. The kitchen was quiet around them. Outside, the wind had come up off the mountains, the wind of early spring in Montana that sounds like something trying to get in and not quite managing it. There's never been a survey report, he said. In 9 years of owning this property, I've never seen a document come out of that company. No, Nora said. You haven't. She closed the ledger carefully. Because the survey wasn't commissioned for your benefit. He looked at her. Tomorrow, she said, you need to ride east. There's a man named Calder Pruitt, your uncle's oldest friend from what I could gather from the correspondence files. He was with your uncle in those last months. If anyone knows what happened in August of 1881 with $340 and a surveying company from Dodge City, it's Calder Pruitt. She went to the back room. He heard the door close softly. Cormac sat at the table for a long time after that. He looked at the ledger without opening it. He looked at the dark window and the dark beyond it. He thought about 14 cattle where there should have been 42. He thought about a spring that had been running clean for decades that a man named Devlin had told him was going dry. He thought about $340 paid to a surveying company that had never sent a report. He thought about the fact that all of these things had one common point of connection. Then he got the full ledger from the shelf. The complete record, not the summary he filed with the land office, but the real one showing every transaction in his uncle's handwriting and then in his own, and he sat back down and started at the beginning. He read until past midnight. What he found was not one problem, it was a structure. And structures Cormac Wren had learned in 20 years of working, metal did not build themselves. Somewhere on the property, a spring ran cold and clean through the night, feeding water through 60 yards of new pipe into a trough that his cattle were already learning to trust. That was real. That had been his hands and his work, and Nora Voss's surveying level and her silence when silence was what was needed. But it was one step, a first step. And the ground ahead was more complicated than he'd understood this morning when he stood in the frost and counted 14 cattle and thought the problem was simply one of numbers. The problem was not numbers. He closed the ledger. He sat in his uncle's kitchen in the house his uncle had built on land. His uncle had loved, and he understood something that had taken him 9 years and 1 long day to arrive at. He had not been failing this land. This land had been failed for him. By someone who had calculated with considerable patience that he would never find out why. Cormac Wren set the ledger on the table and went to bed. Tomorrow he would ride to Calder Pruitt. Cormac Wren rode east before first light. He did not wake Nora. He left a note on the kitchen table 2 lines specific and without embellishment, and saddled his horse in the dark barn by feel, the way a man does when he has saddled the same horse in the same barn enough times that the darkness stops mattering. The road to Calder Pruitt's place ran along the base of the foothills for 4 miles, before turning north through a stand of cottonwood that had been old when Aldous Wren first came to this territory. Calder had lived in the same house for 38 years. He had outlasted 2 wives, 1 flood, and the loneliness that settles into men who stay in one place long enough to watch everyone else leave. He was 70 years old, and he had the steady, unhurried eyes of someone who had survived a long time by watching carefully and speaking only when the watching was done. He was already up when Cormac arrived. Smoke from the chimney and light in the east window, and Calder standing on the porch with a coffee cup as if he had been expecting company and had simply been waiting to see which direction it would come from. "Cormac," he said. "Calder." Cormac dismounted and tied his horse to the post. "I need to talk to you about August of 1881. Something moved in the old man's face. Not surprise. Something older than surprise, the expression of a man who has been carrying a question for a long time and has just heard someone else finally ask it. "Come inside," Calder said. "Coffee's on." They sat at a table that had been in the same kitchen for 3 decades. Calder poured. Outside, the first gray light was beginning to separate the tree line from the sky. Cormac put the ledger on the table open to the august 1881 entry and turned it so Calder could read it. The old man looked at it for a long time without speaking. $340, Cormac said, paid to a surveying company in Dodge City. No report ever came back, no documentation in any of the ranch files. My uncle signed the disbursement 2 months before he died. Calder set his coffee cup down. He looked at his hands, the hands of a man who has worked outdoors for 50 years and carries the history of it in every joint. I was with him most of that summer, he said finally. Your uncle. When the sickness got bad enough that he couldn't work the land, I'd come by most days. Sit with him. We'd been friends 40 years. You don't stop showing up for 40 years because things get hard. Cormac waited. A man came in July, Calder said. Well dressed. Not from here, you could tell by the cut of his coat and the way he held himself, the way men from the cities hold themselves in open country like they're uncomfortable with the amount of sky. He said he was a railroad agent. Said there was serious interest in running a spur line through this section of the territory, and that he needed to survey several properties along the potential route to assess their value for possible acquisition. And my uncle believed him. Your uncle was sick, Cormac. Calder's voice was careful, not defensive, just accurate. He wasn't confused all the time, but there were days. And this man was very good, smooth, knew the right things to say about the railroad, knew enough about land assessment to sound authoritative. He told Aldous the survey would take 2 weeks and that the results would be sent directly to the ranch. He collected the $340 from your uncle's account and he left. And the results never came. Aldous asked about them twice before he died. I was there both times. He asked with the worry of a sick man who knows his time is running short and wants to leave things in order, wants to know what the land is worth, whether there are opportunities he should pass on to you. The man never came back. The results never came. Calder looked at Cormac directly. I looked into it afterward. 6 months after Aldous was gone and you'd been on the property a while. The railroad story didn't hold. There was no spur line project for this section. No railroad agent matching his description on record with any company operating in Montana territory at that time. You looked into it, Cormac said slowly. Found nothing, and didn't tell me. A long silence. I had no proof of anything, Calder said. A man I couldn't identify taking money from a sick friend under false pretenses. That's a wrong thing, but it's not something you bring to a county court without a name and a document. All I had was a feeling and the knowledge that your uncle had been fooled in his last weeks, and I didn't see what telling you would do except add grief to a situation that already had enough of it. Cormac sat with that. Who else knew about the man's visit? He said. Aldous wouldn't have told many people. He was private about his business affairs, especially toward the end. Calder paused. But there was one thing. When the man arrived, he asked whether Aldous had a business associate he dealt with regularly. Someone who handled financial matters. Aldous mentioned Douglas Hahn. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the cottonwoods were beginning to show in the growing light, their bare branches making a pattern against the pale sky. He mentioned Hahn, Cormac said. By name. I was in the room. Cormac stood. He put the ledger under his arm. He looked at Calder Pruitt for a moment, at the old man's face, which carried the weight of someone who has held something too long and is relieved to finally set it down. I need you to write down what you just told me, Cormac said. Everything. The man's description, what he said when he came, what Aldous signed. Written and signed with your name. I'll do it today, Calder said. I'll send someone to collect it this afternoon. Cormac put on his hat. And Calder, I'm not angry with you. You didn't have what you needed to act. I'm going to get it. He rode back to the ranch without stopping. Nora was in the east pasture when he returned, walking the fence line with her notebook open. He came to her directly and told her everything. Calder's account of the man who'd come in July 1881. The railroad pretense, the $340, the results that had never arrived, and the moment his uncle had mentioned Douglas Hahn's name to a stranger who had come to take something from him. Nora had stopped walking. She looked at him with the focused attention of someone who has been working a puzzle and has just seen how two pieces connect. "We need Harlow Finch," she said, "the lawyer. This afternoon." He left within the hour, stopping at Calder's on his way through to arrange for the written statement to be collected by messenger. Harlow Finch kept an office above the feed store on Millhaven's Main Street, a spare space with 2 filing cabinets that wouldn't close properly, and the atmosphere of a room where serious things had been said so many times the walls had absorbed them. He was 55 with wire-framed glasses and the economical manner of someone who had spent 30 years listening to people's worst problems and learned to respond with precision rather than sympathy. Cormac laid the ledger on Finch's desk and told him everything in order. The August 1881 entry, Calder's account, the railroad man who wasn't a railroad man, the $340, the survey results that had never come. Finch listened without interrupting. When Cormac finished, the lawyer took off his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and said, "The surveying company. You have a name, Meridian Survey and Assessment, Dodge City, Kansas." Finch made a note. "I have a contact there who handles incorporation records. Give me 2 days." "I don't have much more than 90 days total," Cormac said. "You'll have it in 2. Finch studied the ledger entry. If this company was formed specifically to conduct fraudulent assessments and then dissolved after the fact, there will be records of both its founding and its dissolution. Corporate records in Kansas are public document. The question is whose names appear in the founding structure." He paused. "If Hahn's name appears anywhere in that company, we have a direct connection between him and the false survey. And what does that connection give us? Grounds to challenge the legitimacy of the secondary lien he holds on your property," Finch said. "A creditor who obtained his position through fraud or deception has no enforceable claim in a court of law." He paused again. "It also potentially gives us grounds for a criminal complaint, which is a different matter on a different timeline, but it should be on record regardless." Cormac rode home with the late afternoon light behind him. That evening, after the horses were seen to, and the cattle checked, and the supper dishes cleared, Cormac sat at the kitchen table with a blank telegraph form and wrote out a message to Ned Farrow. He had thought about this on the ride home. Farrow had worked the ranch for 18 months before Devlin arrived, an older hand, careful with animals, the kind of man who noticed things and said little. When Cormac had been forced to let the hands go, Farrow had shaken his hand and said he was sorry for the situation and ridden south. Cormac had heard through the loose network of men who moved between ranches that he'd settled in Laredo, Texas. The message was short. He asked Farrow whether he recalled Devlin advising Cormac to abandon the North Spring water source in 1882, and whether that advice had come from Devlin independently or at the direction of someone else. He offered to cover the cost of Farrow's time and any expenses related to a response. He signed it with his name and sealed it. He rode to the telegraph office first thing the next morning and sent it before Millhaven had fully woken up. Then he went back to work. The work in those days had a different quality than the 9 years before. Not easier, because the physical demands of a working ranch don't change because you've understood something new about your situation, but different in direction. He repaired the east fence line properly, setting new posts at depth with lumber ordered from the mill. He moved the remaining herd to the rested north section and watched them settle onto grass that had been waiting 18 months for this chance. He weighed each animal individually, the way Nora had shown him, recording the numbers in a plain paper notebook she'd given him for the purpose. Nora worked alongside him, and she worked separately from him, and she worked in the hours when he was sleeping because she had a preliminary assessment report to complete and documentation standards to maintain that would make what they were building unchallengeable in a court of law. On the second morning after Cormac had sent the telegraph, they were in the north pasture, checking the relocated herd, when Nora looked up from her notebook and said, "Hahn is coming." Cormac turned. Douglas Hahn was 58 years old and carried it well in the way of men who have spent their lives indoors managing money rather than outdoors managing land. He was well dressed in the way that frontier wealth expressed itself. Good fabric, clean lines, nothing ostentatious, everything quietly expensive. He had a wide-open face that was practiced at appearing uncomplicated and pale eyes that were practiced at appearing merely curious when they were actually measuring. He came through the gate and tied his horse to the post with the ease of a man who has done this before at this property in conditions he considered he understood. "Cormac," he said, crossing the yard. "I was in the area. Thought I'd stop in and see how things were progressing." Cormac walked toward him at an unhurried pace. "Good of you," he said. "The meeting was set for Saturday." "Just passing through?" Hahn looked toward the north pasture. "Cattle looking better. 19 head now," Cormac said. "We recovered 5 from the east section earlier this week through fence breach analysis, and we've redirected the water supply." Something moved in Hahn's expression. Very small, very fast. Cormac would have missed it if he hadn't been watching for it, but he had been watching. He had been watching everything carefully for days now. Ever since a woman with a ledger had taught him by example that watching carefully was how you learned the true grade of the ground you were standing on. "From the creek," Hahn said. His voice was even. "From the North Spring," Cormac said. "Turns out it's been running clean and strong the whole time. We tested it. No sulfate issues, none of the contamination problems we've had with the creek water." He looked at Hahn directly. "Good news, given the water rights documentation from 1875. That spring is legally established as the primary source for this property. I should have been using it all along." A pause, brief but present. "Who told you to switch to the creek?" Hahn said. "Devlin," Cormac said. "Your man." The pleasantness in Hahn's face did not change exactly, but something behind it shifted the adjustment of a man who has encountered an obstacle and is deciding how to incorporate it without revealing that he's doing so. He was very good at the adjustment. "Devlin worked for the ranch," Hahn said. "Not for me." "He came with your recommendation," Cormac said pleasantly. "I recommend men to a lot of people. Doesn't make them mine." Hahn glanced toward the barn. "How's the consultant working out?" "Very well. The preliminary report will be ready for Hendricks by Saturday." Cormac kept his voice level. "We're looking forward to the meeting." Hahn nodded in the way of a man absorbing information that is inconvenient and choosing to appear unaffected. He made small talk about the weather and the cattle market for another 5 minutes, and then he said his goodbyes with the smooth courtesy that was his natural register, untied his horse, and rode back the way he'd come. Cormac watched him go until the horse disappeared around the bend in the pines. Then he went inside and told Nora what had been said. She listened, made 2 notes, and said, "He came to see how bad things still were. He needed to know whether the assessment was producing real findings or just paperwork." She closed her notebook. "Now he knows it's real. Does that help us or hurt us? It hurries him," she said. "Men like Hahn are patient when they believe they have time. When they understand time is running short, they make moves." She looked at him. "Saturday's meeting, he'll bring pressure. Be ready for it not to come from the direction you expect." Finch's telegram arrived on the 3rd day after Cormac had sent his message to Dodge City. Cormac read it at the telegraph office, standing at the counter with the slip of paper in his hands, and read it again and folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and walked back to his horse without speaking to the clerk, who was watching him with the bright curiosity of someone who can tell that what they've just handed over matters. Meridian survey and assessment had been incorporated in March of 1880. It had been dissolved in November of 1881, 6 weeks after Aldous Wren's death in September, 1 month after Cormac took possession of the property in October. Among its founding documents, buried 2 layers deep in the corporate structure under the name of a business associate listed as a silent partner, Douglas Hahn of Millhaven County, Montana Territory. 40% stake. He was in the saddle before the telegraph paper had finished cooling in his pocket. Nora read it at the kitchen table. She read it once, then again, then set it down. "He built the company before your uncle's illness," she said. He had it in place waiting. When your uncle got sick, he sent his man to collect the information he needed, the real property boundaries, the water rights documentation, the geological data. He paid for it with your uncle's own money and dissolved the company before anyone thought to look. Cormac was standing at the window. The north pasture was visible from here, the cattle moving slowly across grass that had been resting for 18 months, the water line running clean from the spring. "What is this land actually worth?" he said. "Under correct management." She had figures she'd been working on since the first day. Between $6,000 and $8,000, possibly more if the water rights are fully documented and included in a sale assessment. The county land office has it valued at $3,800 based on the current degraded condition. My total debt is $4,000. $2,200 to the land office, $1,800 to Harn. Cormac turned from the window. He could foreclose for $4,000 and acquire an $8,000 property. "That's been the plan since 1881, she said. He built it in layers, nothing dramatic, nothing that would draw attention, just one deliberate step at a time. Bad cattle from a supplier he recommended, bad water from a source his man told you to switch to, exhausted soil from a practice nobody questioned because it was what your uncle had always done." She looked at the telegram. And underneath all of it, he already knew exactly what he was sitting on, because he paid $340 of your uncle's money to find out. The room was very quiet. Cormac sat down. For a moment he just sat with his hands flat on the table, looking at them, the hands of a man who had been building something for 9 years while someone else dismantled the foundation beneath him. "He watched me fail," he said. "He helped you fail," she said. "And then he waited." Ned Farrow's reply came the following morning. Cormac read it at the kitchen table, the paper flat in front of him in the early light. Farrow had written in the blunt shorthand of a man unaccustomed to telegraphs, but clear enough when it mattered. "Yes. Devlin told me spring was running dry and said Harn had it on good authority from a geological man. Told me to pass it to you as my own observation so it wouldn't come back to Harn. I am sorry I did it. I needed the work. Will testify if required. Ned Farrow Laredo." Cormac read it twice. Then he looked out the window at the north pasture, at the clean water moving through the pipe he had laid with his own hands, feeding cattle that were drinking from a source that someone had spent 2 years in deliberate effort convincing him was gone. "Devlin to Farrow to me," he said when Nora came in. He slid the telegram across to her. "Documented, witnessed, and Farrow is willing to testify." She read it, set it on the stack with the other documents. 3 days before Saturday, she said. "We go to Finch this afternoon with everything. He needs time to draft." 3 days before Saturday, they went to Finch. That same afternoon, Cormac rode to Emmett Hale's ranch. He went alone, and he told Hale enough, not everything, not the full architecture of it yet, but enough. He told him about the Haskell County cattle and what the mortality records showed. He told him about the water situation at his own ranch and the deliberate misdirection. He did not name Harn directly. He asked Hale, in the careful way of men who understand each other, whether he had ever been advised about water sources or cattle suppliers by anyone connected to his lending arrangements. Hale was quiet for a long time, long enough that the silence itself was an answer. Then he said, "A man who came around when I first took the secondary paper said the creek on my east section was a more stable source than the spring I'd been using. He looked at his own pasture. Said the spring had drainage problems going into the hard winters." "What was his name?" "Devlin." Cormac nodded once. "I need a signed statement, what Devlin told you when, and the name of whoever arranged your introduction to the Haskell County suppliers. I need it in writing with your name, and I need it in 2 days." "You'll have it today," Hale said. Tom Vesper took longer, because Vesper had been frightened for so long that the fear had become structural, built into how he moved through his days, how he made decisions, how he weighed the cost of any action against the cost of remaining still. Cormac sat with him on his porch for 2 hours. He didn't pressure. He told his own story and let Vesper do the arithmetic. Because some things a man has to arrive at in his own time, and the arriving is as important as the destination. By the end of the second hour, Tom Vesper signed. Cormac brought both statements to Finch the following morning, along with Calder Pruitt's written account, which had arrived by messenger 3 pages, in Calder's careful handwriting, precise and detailed, in the way of a man who understood that what he was writing might matter in a court of law, and was treating it accordingly. Finch read all of it. He took his glasses off. He put them back on. "File, Monday," he said. "Lien challenge and criminal complaint simultaneously. The civil filing protects the ranch. The criminal matter will move slower, but it needs to be on record." He gathered the papers into an ordered stack. "And before Saturday's meeting, I'll send a preliminary communication to Hendricks at the land office regarding questions about the secondary lien documentation. Nothing specific. Just enough that he knows questions have been raised." "Will Hahn know about that communication before Saturday?" Cormac said. "If Hendricks mentions it to him, yes." Finch looked at him. "That's intentional. A man who knows a question is coming will sometimes reveal more in trying to get ahead of it than he would if it arrived without warning." Cormac rode home in the last of the Thursday light. That evening after supper, after the dishes were cleared and the lanterns adjusted, and Nora had gone back to the assessment report she was completing for Hendricks, Cormac sat alone at the kitchen table. He reached into the shelf above the fireplace and took down the tin box that had sat there since he'd moved it from his uncle's bedroom in the first weeks after taking possession. He'd moved it without opening it. He had always intended to go through it properly, and he'd never found the time, and eventually it had become one of those things that stays in its place because moving it would require making a decision about it. He set it on the table and opened it. Inside were the things his uncle had kept. Small things, a bill of sale from 1873 with the original purchase price for the land. A letter from Ohio, his uncle's sister, 20 years old. A photograph worn at the corners of Aldous Wren, standing in front of the half-built barn in what must have been the summer of 1874, squinting into the sun with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe his luck. And at the bottom, folded and unaddressed, a letter in his uncle's backward slanting handwriting. Cormac unfolded it. He read. His uncle had written about a feeling. The feeling of a man who looks at his circumstances and understands, without being able to fully name what he understands, that the shape of his difficulties is not natural, that what appears to be a collection of small problems is actually something arranged. He wrote about the man who had come to survey the land in July, about the discomfort he'd felt during that visit that he hadn't been able to name at the time, about a question he kept returning to: why would a railroad company need detailed geological information about a private ranch, and why would they need a private individual to pay for it, rather than commissioning the survey themselves? He wrote about Douglas Hahn. Not accusations, just observations, the attention Hahn had shown to the property's value in recent conversations, the questions about water sources and boundary definitions. The offer he'd made to purchase the land 2 months before the surveyor arrived, which Aldous had declined because he had promised this land to his nephew, and a promise was a promise. The last paragraph was short. "I cannot prove what I suspect, but I have tried to keep good records, and I trust that if something is wrong here, Cormac will find someone better at seeing than I have been. I built this land for him. I hope it reaches him the way I meant it to." The letter was dated August the 14th, 1881. 6 weeks before Aldous Wren died. Cormac sat with it for a long time. Then he folded it, stood up, and walked to the back room where the light was still showing under the door. He knocked. "Come in," Nora said. He went in. She was at the small desk with papers around her and the lamp turned high. She looked at him, then at the letter in his hand. He held it out. She took it, read it once, read it again, and set it down on the desk. "He knew," Cormac said. "He felt it," she said. "He didn't have the proof, but he felt the shape of it." She looked at the letter. 6 weeks before he died, your uncle sat down and wrote this because he understood that something was wrong and he couldn't stop it alone, and he did the only thing available to him." She met Cormac's eyes. "He trusted you to find someone who could see what he couldn't." Cormac looked at the letter on the desk. "Where did Calder get it?" he said. "I'll ask him tomorrow," she said. "But this letter goes with us on Saturday, and it goes into Finch's filing on Monday." She picked it up carefully and set it with the other documents. This is what changes the room, Cormac. Not the corporate records, not the telegraph from Laredo. This, a dying man's account of feeling a trap close around him in his own handwriting, dated 6 weeks before the man who built the trap extended a secondary lien to his nephew. Cormac stood in the doorway for a moment. "Get some sleep," Nora said, already turning back to her papers. "Saturday is going to require your full attention." He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time, thinking about his uncle, standing in front of the half-built barn in the summer of 1874, squinting into the sun, unable to believe his luck. About a man who had built something with his own hands and spent his last weeks trying to protect it for the nephew he believed in, and had done it with nothing more than a letter, and the hope that it would find the right hands eventually. It had found the right hands. Outside, the North Spring ran clean through the pipe he had laid himself, and 19 cattle drank from it in the dark, and the ground was beginning slowly and without ceremony to remember what it was for. Saturday came in cold and clear. The kind of morning that doesn't announce itself, just arrives fully formed, with the mountains to the north going blue and white in the first light, and the air tasting of snow melt and pine. The kind of morning that doesn't particularly care what's going to happen in it. The land was indifferent, the day was indifferent. What happened in it was up to the people who showed up. Cormac was up before light dressed and at the kitchen table with coffee before Nora came out. She had the assessment report in front of her when she sat down, 40 pages completed in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, because that was when she worked, when the situation warranted it, and this situation had warranted it for days. Beside the report sat the organized stack of documentation they had assembled, the water rights filing from 1875, the original boundary survey from 1873, the ledger page with the $340 entry, the Dodge City telegram confirming Harn's stake and Meridian survey and assessment, Calder Pruitt's signed statement, Ned Farrow's telegram from Laredo, the signed statements from Emmett Hale and Tom Vesper and his uncle's letter. 8 documents, 8 layers. Each one a nail pulled from a structure that Douglas Harn had spent 4 years building and that Cormac Wren had spent 4 days learning to name. "Eat something?" Nora said without looking up from the report. He made eggs and put a plate in front of her. She ate without commenting on it, still reading. He ate standing at the window looking out at the north pasture, where 19 head moved in the early light with the ease of animals that have been drinking clean water for 5 days and have begun to understand that their circumstances have changed. "Let him open," Nora said. "Whatever Harn says when we walk in, let him state his position before you state yours." "I know. He'll say something about my qualifications. Let it sit. Hendricks will have read the report." She turned a page. "And he'll say something designed to make you angry. He'll say it quietly, and he'll pick his moment. Whatever it is, you hold your ground, and you say nothing until it's your turn." Cormac picked up his coffee cup. "How many of these rooms have you been in?" "Enough," she said, "to know that the person who speaks first out of anger loses the room before the evidence is on the table." They rode into Millhaven together. The town was moving in its Saturday way, livestock commerce families in from the outlying ranches, the social energy of people who saw each other once a week and had formed opinions in the interim. Cormac felt the looks as they came down the main street. He had felt looks for 9 years in this town, the weight of a community watching a man fail in slow motion. These looks were different, less like pity, more like attention. The Millhaven County Land Office occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on the north end of the main street. The front room held 3 desks and 2 filing cabinets and smelled of paper and lamp oil and the staleness of official spaces that never quite aired out. Douglas Harn was already inside. He was not alone. Beside him stood Hendricks, the regional supervisor, compact, permanently slightly overextended, responsible for too many jurisdictions. And beside Hendricks stood a third man Cormac didn't recognize, well-dressed, younger than Harn, with the bearing of a lawyer brought in from somewhere else. From the coat, Cormac guessed Helena. Harn looked up when they entered. His expression moved through what appeared to be pleasant surprise. "Cormac," he said, "and Miss Voss." The way he said her name suggested he was still deciding what category to put her in. "We were both invited," Cormac said. They sat. The Helena lawyer's name was Prescott. Introductions were made with the minimal courtesy of people who are not in the room to be courteous. Hendricks opened a folder. "Mr. Harn has raised some concerns regarding the current assessment process," he said. "Specifically, whether the consulting arrangement entered into by this office adequately satisfies the professional standards outlined in the operating agreement for the Wren property loan." Prescott leaned forward. "The concern is one of licensure and professional standing. Miss Voss has represented herself as an agricultural consultant, but there is no formal licensing structure for that designation in Montana Territory for women, which raises questions about whether the land office's reliance on her assessment creates a procedural vulnerability." He said it smoothly, and he said it well. Nora placed the assessment report on the table, aligned it with the edge, and slid it across toward Hendricks. Hendricks picked it up and began to read. Hahn watched Hendricks read. Cormac watched Hahn. A long silence filled the room, the sound of pages turning and the distant noise of Saturday commerce from the street outside. Hahn's expression was patient and controlled. Prescott made small notes. Outside, a wagon passed with a wheel that needed attention. Hendricks set the report down. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. "You redirected the primary water source on day 2, he said. "Yes. And the herd count moved from 14 to 19 in the first week. 5 head recovered from the east boundary through fence breach analysis. The drift pattern was directional. The animals were following water scent from the creek tributary on the neighboring section. The recovery was predictable once the fence history was mapped." Hendricks turned pages. He was reading the recovery projections now, the pasture rotation schedule, the water quality, comparative analysis. He read with the attention of a man who understood what he was looking at and was finding more there than he'd expected. Prescott said, "The quality of the report doesn't address the underlying procedural question of—" "I'm reading," Hendricks said. Not sharply, just with the finality of a man who has made a decision and is communicating it without announcement. Prescott stopped talking. Hahn's eyes moved to Cormac. An assessment brief and careful, the look of a man deciding whether a situation is still manageable. Cormac looked back and said nothing. Hendricks closed the report. He removed his glasses, cleaned them on his sleeve, replaced them. He looked at Prescott. "The contract between this office and Miss Voss designates her role as agricultural consultant for assessment and advisory services," he said. "There is no licensure requirement in territorial law for that designation. The concern Mr. Harn has raised would apply to a licensed agricultural officer, which is a different engagement category." He set his glasses down. "The contract language is specific and it is clean." Prescott began an argument about the practical function of the role constituting "additionally." Hendricks said in the same even tone, "I received a communication Friday afternoon from Harlow Finch regarding questions about the secondary lien documentation on the Wren property." He looked at Hahn directly. "Are you aware of that communication, Douglas?" A pause. "Very small, very controlled." "I've been made aware of it," Hahn said. "Then you understand this office views any attempt to interfere with an ongoing lawful assessment, particularly one that may produce evidence relevant to a separate legal inquiry, as a matter of serious concern." Hendricks gathered his folder. "The assessment continues. Miss Voss's contract stands." He stood. The meeting was over. Prescott looked at Hahn. Hahn looked at the table for a moment, at the assessment report sitting there with its 40 pages of precise documentation that had just survived the challenge he'd designed to eliminate it. Then he stood and thanked Hendricks for his time, and walked out without looking at Cormac. Cormac and Nora followed a minute later. The morning air on the main street was cold and bright. Nora had her ledger under her arm and was already writing something in it. They had started toward the horses when Cormac heard his name. He turned. Hahn was standing at the edge of the boardwalk 20 feet away, alone. Prescott was gone. The pleasantness in Hahn's face had been set aside the way you set aside a tool you've finished using. "A word," Hahn said. "Privately." Cormac looked at Nora. She gave him the smallest nod. Not permission, but acknowledgement. She turned and walked toward the horses at a pace that covered the distance without appearing to hurry. Cormac walked toward Hahn. They stood on the boardwalk away from the foot traffic. Hahn's pale eyes were doing the thing they always did, measuring, but today there was something underneath the measuring that hadn't been there before. Something that resembled the earliest stage of concern. "I want to make this easier," Hahn said, "for both of us. I'll settle the lien at a reduced figure. Clear the debt, sign the property over to me, and I'll leave you with enough to start somewhere else. Wyoming, Colorado. Good land is opening up in both territories. A man of your capabilities could build something new." Cormac said nothing. "Your uncle was a good man," Hahn said, "but he was realistic about certain things. He understood the limits of what he could pass on." A pause timed carefully. "He came to me, Cormac, in the summer of 1881. He said he was worried the land would be a burden on you, that you'd inherited his ambitions without inheriting his understanding of what the ground could actually support." The boardwalk was solid under Cormac's boots. The mountain air was cold. The main street of Millhaven moved around them, and none of it was touching him because he was focused entirely on the man in front of him and on what he knew. He thought about Calder Pruitt in his kitchen, saying, "Your uncle talked about you in those last weeks, about leaving it to you, about hoping you'd make it what he never could." He thought about the letter in his coat pocket written in his uncle's backward slanting hand, dated 6 weeks before Aldous Wren died. "I built this land for him. I hope it reaches him the way I meant it to." He thought about $340 paid to a company that Douglas Hahn had founded in 1880 and dissolved the month after Aldous Wren was in the ground. He looked at Hahn. "No," he said. One word. He let it sit in the cold air between them for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward his horse. He did not look back. He could feel Hahn watching him go, the weight of a man's attention when that man is recalibrating, deciding what his next move is going to be. Cormac didn't care about the next move. He cared about Monday. Nora was already mounted when he reached the horses. She looked at his face once in the way she looked at everything, extracting information from what she observed, and then she turned her horse toward the eastern road and rode. He rode beside her. After a while, she said, "What did he offer? The ranch plus enough to start somewhere else?" Cormac kept his eyes on the road. "And he told me my uncle came to him voluntarily. Said my uncle told him I couldn't handle the land." She rode for a moment without answering. "Did it land?" she said. He thought about it honestly, the way she had taught him by example to think about things. "For a second," he said. "Then I thought about the letter." "Good," she said. They rode the rest of the way home without speaking, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have said the necessary things and understand that what remains now is work. Monday morning, Harlow Finch filed the lien challenge and the criminal complaint simultaneously as agreed. By noon, word had moved through Millhaven in the way that important things move through small towns, faster than feet, carry it driven by nothing more than the specific gravity of something people have been waiting to hear, without knowing they were waiting. Fuller. The telegraph runner came out to the ranch at 2 p.m. with a message from Finch confirming the filings. He stayed on his horse, rather than dismounting, and his manner had the brightness of someone who has witnessed something he considers significant. "People are talking," he said. "They always are," Cormac said, "talking different than before." Fuller hesitated. Mrs. Alcott at the land office said she always thought there was something wrong about how the Hale operation was going under, said it never added up to the work those men were putting in. He looked at Cormac with something that approached respect. Vesper's wife told the dressmaker this morning that her husband slept better last night than he has in 2 years. Cormac thanked him and went back to work. The days that followed were long and specific. He repaired the east fence with posts set deep, doing the work himself because it was his land and his fence, and doing it himself was the appropriate way to do it. He took individual weight assessments on every animal in the herd, recording each number in his notebook with the same deliberateness he was bringing to everything now. The deliberateness that comes from understanding that records are how you prove to the world what you know to be true. On Wednesday, Calder Pruitt rode out unannounced, which was his way, and tied his horse and stood in the yard, looking at the north pasture before Cormac came out to meet him. "Herd looks better," Calder said. 20 head now. One of the recovered east cattle turned out to be in calf. We didn't know it when we brought her back. She delivered Monday morning. Calf is healthy." Calder nodded with the slow confirmation of a man who had hoped for exactly this. "Heard about the filing," he said. "Word gets around." "Han's been quiet since Saturday." The old man looked at the mountains. "That worries me more than when he's moving." "I know. Finch says his lawyers will respond within the week." Cormac stood beside him. "When it goes to hearing, you'll need to testify. Everything you told me, everything in the statement in front of a judge." Calder turned and looked at him with those steady eyes. "I've been waiting to say it in front of a judge for 3 years, he said. "I'll be there." They went inside. Calder sat at the kitchen table that had been Aldous Wren's table for 30 years and drank his coffee and told Cormac things about his uncle that Cormac hadn't known, small, specific things that only accumulate between people who've known each other across decades. What Aldous had said about the land in those last weeks. What he'd hoped for, what he'd said about Cormac. None of it resembled what Han had told him on the boardwalk on Saturday. All of it resembled the letter. Nora came in from the east pasture toward the end of the afternoon and met Calder for the first time without ceremony, walked in. Saw him, shook his hand with the directness she brought to everything, sat down with her notebook and listened to the end of what he was saying. When Calder finished, she said, "Mr. Pruitt, when you testify, they'll ask why you kept the letter for 3 years without bringing it forward. They'll suggest it diminishes its evidentiary value." Calder looked at her with those steady old eyes. "What do I say? You say that you kept it because you had no proof to attach it to, that a letter from a dead man isn't proof of anything without documentation of what it was pointing at." She met his gaze. "And that the documentation now exists." Calder was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Cormac. "She's something." "She is," Cormac said. Nora had already returned to her notebook. 3 weeks after the filing on a Tuesday morning in late May, Devlin was brought into the Millhaven Sheriff's office. The deputy who conducted the interview had Ned Farrow's telegram in his coat pocket and the signed statements from Hale and Vesper on the desk when Devlin sat down. Devlin talked. When a man is sitting across a desk from a county deputy with a telegram that directly contradicts the story he's been telling himself for 2 years, and when that deputy slides 3 sworn statements alongside it, the calculation changes. What had felt like a comfortable silence becomes a weight with dimensions and edges. Some men, when the weight becomes that concrete, set it down. Devlin set it down completely. He talked about the North Spring and what he'd been directed to tell Cormac about it. He talked about the Haskell County suppliers and how the referrals had been arranged. He talked about 3 other properties, not 2 but 3 others across Millhaven County, where Douglas Hahn had applied variations of the same approach over the previous 7 years. Different details in each case. The same architecture underneath. Identify land with hidden value. Position yourself as a creditor with favorable terms. Introduce sources of operational failure that compound slowly enough to look like bad luck and poor management. Wait. It was not a crime of opportunity. It was a system. Finch added the 3 additional properties to the criminal complaint. The hearing on the lien challenge was set for the 14th of June before Judge Aldgate. Finch described Aldgate to Cormac as a man who had been on the bench for 11 years, was not Harn's man. Whatever Harn might believe about that, and responded well to evidence and poorly to theater. "Give him evidence and don't give him theater," Finch said. "That's all I have," Cormac said. "Then you're in good shape." The morning of the 14th arrived without ceremony. Cormac dressed in his town coat and drank his coffee standing at the window. Nora was at the table with the final documentation stack, reviewing the order of submission one more time in the way of someone who checks their work, not because they doubt it, but because thoroughness is how they respect the importance of what they're doing. They rode into Millhaven together. The courthouse smelled of pine resin and old paper. Judge Aldgate was a tall man of 60 with white hair and the deliberate economy of someone who had learned that everything worth doing was worth doing without excess. He read Hahn's challenge response. He read Finch's filing. He read the contract between the land office and Nora Voss. He read each document in the evidence package in order without rushing, without visible reaction. Prescott made his arguments with practiced competence. He built a case around professional designation procedural standards, the land office's obligations under the operating agreement. It was well constructed for a case built on the wrong foundation. Finch stood and read from the assessment report. Not all of it, but the key findings. The water source analysis, the cattle recovery data, the pasture rotation results, the trajectory of documented improvement across 6 weeks. He read in the flat, precise voice of a man allowing evidence to speak without embellishment. Then he submitted the Devlin testimony summary, the Hale and Vesper statements, Calder Pruitt's signed account, the Dodge City corporate records, and the Faro telegram. Prescott objected to relevance on 3 items. Aldgate overruled all 3 without elaborating on the reasons, which told Cormac everything he needed to know about where the judge had already arrived. Then Cormac stood up. He had not been coached extensively. Finch had told him to tell the truth in the order it happened. Nora had told him to speak to Aldgate rather than the room. Calder had told him simply over supper the evening before, tell him about the spring. A man who has never had his water stolen can still understand what it means to have it given back. Cormac told them about the spring. He told them about Devlin coming to him in April of 1882 with the advice that the North Spring was running dry. He told them about switching the water supply to the East Creek without testing it because the advice had come through a man he trusted from a man he trusted more. He told them about the creek's sulfate content and what it had done to his herd over 2 years. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly. The way a slow thing does its damage by being too gradual to name until the damage is already done. He told them about the water rights documentation from 1875 and the 5-year abandonment clause, and how close he had come through no fault of his own, through the deliberate counsel of a man whose employer held a lien on his property to losing the legal right to the cleanest water source on his land. He told them about the spring running clean and cold into the trough he had rebuilt in the first days of April, and about 2 cattle finding it and drinking from it the way animals drink when they've found what they've been needing. He told them about 14 head, and the 42 the records showed. About the Haskell County bloodlines, and 9 years of working as hard as he knew how to work on a foundation that someone had carefully arranged to fail. He told them about his uncle. And then he took the letter from his coat pocket. The letter in his uncle's backward slanting hand, dated August 14th, 1881. 6 weeks before Aldous Wren died, and he handed it to Finch, who handed it to the clerk, who handed it to Judge Aldgate. Aldgate read it. The courtroom was very quiet while he read. Prescott made no objection. Hahn, sitting at the opposing table, was very still with his hands flat in front of him and his face arranged into composure, but the stillness was the stillness of effort rather than ease. Aldgate set the letter down, slowly. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Douglas Hahn with the attention of a man who has just read a dying person's account of feeling a trap close around them and has formed a clear opinion about who built the trap. He didn't express the opinion. He didn't need to. The lien challenge presents sufficient evidence of conflict of interest and misrepresentation in the origination of the secondary lending agreement to warrant a full review, Aldgate said. Pending that review, the secondary lien held by Mr. Hahn against the Wren property is frozen. No foreclosure action, no collection action, no legal instrument based on that lien may be executed until the review is complete. He looked at Prescott. Your client should be in communication with his attorney about the separate criminal matter which is proceeding on its own calendar. He stood. The room stood with him. Court adjourned. Prescott spoke quietly to Hahn. Hahn stood very still with the composure of a man working through a range of outcomes and arriving at the one he hadn't planned for. His face was controlled. It would probably stay controlled. Men like Hahn didn't lose their composure in public. They saved their responses for places where no one was watching. Cormac walked out of the courthouse into the late morning light of a June Tuesday and stood on the steps. Finch came out beside him. "The review will take 6 to 8 weeks. Based on what Devlin provided, I expect the lien to be voided entirely." He paused. "You did well in there." "I told the truth in order," Cormac said. "That's all it ever takes. The difficulty is in the preparation that makes it possible." Finch went back inside. Nora came out and stood beside him. She had her ledger under her arm. She looked at the main street with the observing expression she brought to everything reading it, the way she read pastures and water sources and the grade of a hillside before committing to a trench line. After a while, she said, "The north pasture needs the second soil sample this week. I want comparative data before the review period ends." "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. Across the street, Emmett Hale and Tom Vesper stood outside the grain exchange looking over. Cormac raised a hand. They raised theirs. Men who had been frightened for a long time and were beginning to believe that the fear might have a direction and therefore an end. He kept walking. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in late July, the county court issued its order voiding the secondary lien held by Douglas Hahn against the Wren property. The grounds were conflict of interest, misrepresentation in the origination of the lending agreement, and deliberate interference with the operational capacity of the secured asset, which was the legal language for what Hahn had done to the spring and the cattle and the soil across 9 years. Cormac was in the north pasture when Finch's messenger arrived with the document. He read it standing up in the morning light with 24 head of cattle moving behind him on grass that had been resting for 2 years and was coming back with the genuine density of ground that has been given what it needed. One of the cows that had been in the worst condition when he'd separated her in April was grazing 20 feet away with her calf beside her, the calf born on a Monday morning in May, healthy from the first hour. He folded the court order and put it in his coat pocket and stood for another moment looking at the pasture. He thought about his uncle, about Aldous Wren standing in front of the half-built barn in 1874, squinting into the sun, unable to quite believe his luck. About the letter written 6 weeks before he died, trusting a nephew he couldn't warn directly to find someone who could see what he couldn't see. He thought about the right hands turning out to be a woman with a ledger who had arrived on a cold March morning and asked to see the south pasture immediately and had never once looked at the situation as if it were already finished. He took the court order to Nora. She was at the east fence line, moving along it with her notebook recording. He held out the document. She took it, read it once, read it again, folded it and handed it back. 24 head, she said. She was looking at the pasture. 24, he said. The soil samples from Thursday show measurable improvement in the root zone density across the north section. I'm putting it in the final report as documented evidence of recovery trajectory. She made a note. Hendricks wants the report by end of next week. You'll have it done before that, he said. Yes, she said. She kept writing. He stood beside her. The east fence line stretched ahead of them solid now, posts set true and deep lumber from the mill work done properly the first time. The morning was warm in the way of late July in Montana, a warmth that doesn't fight the air, but simply settles into it. The contract, he said. She kept writing. I know. It ends when you file the final report. I know that too. He looked at the fence line, at the pasture beyond it, at the mountains to the north with their remaining high snow going blue in the morning light. 9 years he had looked at this land, and for most of those years had been looking at it through the distortion of what someone had arranged for him to see. A failing operation declining herd soil that wouldn't produce and water that wouldn't nourish. He saw it clearly now. Stay, he said. One word? He let it sit without filling the space around it with explanation or justification. Nora stopped writing. She stood with the notebook open and the pencil in her hand and looked at the fence line for a long moment. Then she looked at him. I would need clear terms, she said. A documented arrangement. I don't operate on informal understandings. Whatever terms you want, he said. Written down. I don't take orders. I know that. I knew it by the end of the first week. Something shifted in her face. Small and careful. The shift of a person who has held herself at a considered distance and is making a deliberate decision about whether to maintain it. I'd want to continue the soil documentation as a longitudinal study, she said. There's enough here for a real finding if tracked properly over 2 or 3 seasons. Use whatever you need. And I want to look at the water rights documentation for the Hale and Vesper properties. If Hahn compromised their water sources the same way he compromised yours, they may have the same recovery path available. I'll introduce you this week. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked down at the notebook and wrote something. When she closed it, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm, just her hand on the sleeve of his coat. The deliberate small gesture of a person who does not make gestures without intention. He placed his hand over hers. They stood at the east fence line of the Wren property in the late July morning, with 24 cattle behind them and clean water running from the north spring through 60 yards of pipe that Cormac had laid with his own hands, and the ground beneath them recovering slowly and without ceremony from 9 years of being asked to give more than it had been allowed to recover. In September, Cormac introduced Nora to Emmett Hale and Tom Vesper as he'd promised. She spent 2 days at each property, walking their land with her level and her notebook, asking the same questions she'd asked when she'd walked into the south pasture of the Wren Ranch in March, and told a man he was short 28 cattle. Both men listened the way Cormac had listened, with the attention of people who have been failing without understanding why and are finally hearing an explanation that fits. The water rights documentation on the Hale property revealed the same pattern. A primary spring legally established abandoned on the advice of a man sent by their creditor in favor of a creek source with measurable contamination problems. The Vesper property showed a variation. The spring itself had been interfered with directly, debris cleared from a natural blockage to redirect the flow away from the property's legal access point. Subtle enough to look like weather, not subtle enough to survive examination by someone who knew what they were looking for. In October, Emmett Hale and Tom Vesper both filed lien challenges through Harlow Finch, supported by Nora's documentation and the precedent established by the Wren ruling. Both challenges were heard before Judge Aldgate. Both were resolved in favor of the property owners within 30 days of filing. In November, Douglas Hahn left Millhaven County. The terms of his agreement with the county prosecutor required him to surrender his financial interest in all 4 affected properties, make restitution for documented operational losses on each, and leave the territory. He departed on a Wednesday morning on the early stage. The stage left at 7. The main street of Millhaven was quiet at that hour. Nobody went to the stage office to see him off because nobody in Millhaven had anything to say to Douglas Hahn that needed to be said in person, and the things that did need saying had already been said in a courtroom with a judge present and a clerk writing everything down. In December, the Millhaven County Agricultural Bulletin published a paper on soil recovery through managed rotation grazing, authored by Nora Voss, agricultural consultant, with documentation drawn from the 6-month recovery record of the Wren property's north and south pastures. It was the first paper of its kind published in the territory. The editor noted in his introduction that the findings had implications for ranching operations across the region. Cormac Wren was cited in the paper as the first rancher in Millhaven County to implement the full rotation system successfully. He accepted this designation with the same absence of fanfare he applied to everything. The insight had been Nora's. What he had contributed was something different: 9 years of refusing to quit, 4 days of learning to see clearly, and the willingness to stand in a county courtroom and tell the truth in the order it had happened. That, and the decision to get up before the sun on a March morning and ride east to talk to an old man who had been carrying a question for 3 years and was relieved finally to have someone to give it to. On a Sunday evening in September, between the lien voiding in July and Hahn's departure in November, in the period when the ranch was running the way it was supposed to run, and the legal matters were resolving on their own timeline, Calder Pruitt came to the ranch for supper. He came the way he did everything, unannounced, unhurried, as if arriving somewhere he had a standing right to arrive. He tied his horse at the post and walked to the door and knocked twice, which was more than he usually bothered with, and came in when Cormac opened it. He sat at the kitchen table that had been Aldous Wren's table for 30 years before it became Cormac's. He accepted the coffee that was poured for him. He looked around the room slowly, the way a man looks at something he has thought about for a long time and is now confirming against the reality. Through the south window, 31 head of cattle were visible in the evening light, moving with the ease of animals that have been eating right and drinking right and living on ground that has been given the time it needed to become itself again. The number had grown steadily through the summer, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way of things that are recovering properly, one step at a time, each step real. Calder looked at the cattle. He looked at Cormac's hands around his coffee cup, the hands of a man who had been working hard in the right direction for 6 months and whose work had produced results proportional to the effort because the foundation under it was finally sound. He looked at Nora across the table, writing in her notebook with the pencil. She always had the ledger open beside her, with its columns of precise and unembellished fact. He sat with all of it for a moment. Then he said to Cormac, "Your uncle would have liked her." Cormac looked at Nora across the table. She didn't look up from the notebook, but something in the line of her mouth changed small, real the expression of a person receiving something they hadn't been expecting to receive. "Yes," Cormac said. He would have. The lamp on the table held its light steady against the early dark of a Montana September evening, and outside on the land that Aldous Wren had built for a nephew he believed in, and that a patient and deliberate man had spent 4 years trying to take apart, 31 cattle moved in the last light on grass that had come back on water, that had been there all along on ground that had needed nothing more and nothing less than the chance to show what it was actually worth.